So it seems that we've got some rules leaks for 40k's latest update in chapter approved Pariah Nexus. Let's take a look over the full rules for the new actions and what it could mean for the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k Pariah Nexus once more, the new update for the mission deck that's going to replace the Leviathan one. And it seems to have been a few interesting leaks floating around on the internet, and I must admit I was kind of interested to see the full text on these actions. Games Workshop had given us some big hints that there were some massive changes coming, and I was interested to see what else there might be. I've talked about the update in a couple of other videos already, but basically this chapter approved mission deck Pariah Nexus replaces the Leviathan one, much in the same way that they did chapter approved books to update the missions halfway through previous editions of the game. Seems kind of likely that this will probably be the second one of 3 for 10th edition. If they stick to their normal timetables, it might well be Leviathan Pariah Nexus, then a third one, and then a new edition at the end of that. We've had plenty of hints, teasers, and previews already. Perhaps one of the single most exciting things are those new secret missions to replace the little used Gambit mechanic. They've changed up some of the primary and secondary missions and the deployment maps, both for ease of clarity and some balance changes. We know that several mission rules help out battle line units in one way or another, that they are kind of matchup specific, and some do sound like they're going to have kind of minimal impact on the overall game. And overall, perhaps the single biggest thing is there'll be a new points, FAQ, and balanced data slate all dropping within the next couple of weeks to support this. AdMech players in particular are looking forward to that, I think, as apparently they're going to have some sort of small rules overhaul for their codex. Alongside all of that, though, perhaps one of the biggest changes that have been teased for a while was to actions. They'd already said that they're basically going to be centrally defined rather than printed on every card. We'd seen a previewed card that referenced an action, and they're really quite an important element of the game, being one of the easiest ways to farm up plenty of victory points. People often quite like to take fixed ones with things like deploy teleport homers and things like that, and lots of competitive lists tended to take at least some cheap mobility type units to do actions, often objective control 0 ones, though that's no longer going to be the case. While we're on the subject of these cards as well, they will be going on pre-order around the world over the next few hours. Feel free to check out the links in the video description if you'd like a bit of a discount on them. If you do buy through any of the discount retailers in the video description, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics as well. Focusing on the actions again though, basically in the previous version of the cards, they represented units doing certain missions like deploying teleport homers or cleansing objectives, and you normally had to give up shooting and charging for this. Previously the rules were written out on each and every card that referenced them, so could often be a little bit clunky and maybe stop the rule from being really all that in depth. They had a few basic things, but they would have struggled to expand to all the stuff that they have done while still fitting it on the same card. The rules for the actions in the Pariah Nexus mission deck are printed on the booklet that comes alongside the cards, basically the rules section for how you set out a game, and in the previous state of affairs, you also generally had to be not battle shocked and also within range of whatever you were trying to do the action with at the end of the turn when you completed it. Now though, moving on to the new rules, there's basically a big list of things that can't do actions and a list of restrictions that you can't do once you've started doing an action. Some of these are the same, but if anything the majority is new or tweaks. For the most part, actions have generally got harder to do rather than easier. Just quickly reading through the list, you can't do an action if your aircraft battle shocked, if the units have OC0, if they advanced or fell back, if they're in engagement range, and if they're not eligible to shoot this phase just in general, most commonly if you've already shot something. Then they specify that until the end of the turn, the unit doing that action can't shoot, declare a charge, start another action, and make any moves at all outside of piling and consolidation moves, and nor can they leave the battlefield. Out of that list, let's go through the things that are actually new. First up, the aircraft change is a new one. That just wasn't a restriction before. You could maybe have aircraft deploying teleport homers, weird as that is. That does go with kind of keeping them out of the objective game though most aircraft also fall foul of the OC0 thing. So even if this rule wasn't a thing, then most of them, most of the time, wouldn't be able to do actions anyway. Kind of makes sense, they just don't really seem like they're designed to work with the objective game. And Games Workshop do seem by design to keeping aircraft out of competitive 40k in general as much as possible. The battle shock thing is unchanged for most of them. Kind of makes sense that if your units are shell shocked from enemy fire, they can't be focusing on doing the admin jobs. The biggest change is the objective control 0 thing, which is probably big enough to warrant its own section, and I'll cycle back to that. Otherwise, the restriction on units advancing or falling back is a new one. Previously, the only restriction was that the unit had to be eligible to shoot, and most of the time in both of those cases you wouldn't be able to. However, even if you got a fancy special rule that allows you still to shoot if you're advanced, like having an assault keyword weapon in the unit, or if you had some sort of rule that allows your unit to fall back and shoot, then you still can't do the action even if you have one of those, so a bit tighter than it was. Perhaps bad news for things like Space Marine Scouts taking a single shotgun in the units to allow them to advance an action when they needed to. Otherwise, on top of that, there's also a change that they're no longer able to do actions in engagement range whatsoever, even if you're still eligible to shoot via pistols or big guns never tire or something. I did feel like for most infantry and things that did feel like a very arbitrary restriction. If they just happened to be a squad that had some small arms to hand, then they could do their teleport home or things, but if they didn't, then they couldn't. This one might be a helpful change for armies that like to rush forward and tag a bunch of things in close combat and just generally annoy them. It might get in the way of doing actions now. Otherwise, most of the other stuff is kind of similar. You can't shoot or declare a charge. Though it technically seems like you can still fight in close combat, though that's going to be kind of niche when that applies now. If you can't charge and you can't start doing the action when you're in engagement range, then most of the time you're not going to be in combat. I guess occasionally it could be relevant if the opponent piles into you. I guess that means that wouldn't break the action. Otherwise, you can't start another action which wasn't really defined before, but usually it sort of still was the case by proxy, because if you started one action like Cleanse, then it stated that the unit was no longer eligible to shoot, and most of the other actions needed the unit to be eligible to shoot to do it. I guess maybe technically the make a move restriction is a little bit more tight than it was previously. I think before the only restriction was to charging, so I guess it might count for some sort of peripheral other moves that you could do with units out of sequence. And the leave the battlefield restriction wasn't really a big deal for most of the standard ones before anyway, as you usually had the positioning requirement when you ended the action. You still had to be in the same place to actually successfully complete it. In general though, the theme is to make them harder. Not ever being able to advance and do them does mean that your units have to be dead close to the point that they need to be to get that job done, and it might emphasize things that just have native fast movement like jump pack units perhaps. And of course, the OC0 thing is going to greatly affect the choice of units they use to try and do this kind of role. There is one rules exception for Titanic characters, interestingly enough. Kind of fun that Games Workshop thought about Big Knights and Chaos Knights with this, where it seems that now Titanic character units are now some of the best units to do actions with in the game, provided you didn't want to charge with them. The exception that they get is they can still shoot while they're doing an action, so you could start an action and still lay down some heavy firepower with rapid fire battle cannons and Avenger Gatling cannons perhaps, and you can also do them when you're in engagement range as well, so if the opponent's tagged a great big Imperial Knight or Chaos Knight, they wouldn't have to worry too much about that and can still get on doing their thing, still fire and fight in combat. They still do have the fairly powerful restriction that they can't declare a charge though, which maybe isn't going to be the best for any fighting knights on the front lines. Most action things that you need to do generally need to be moving aggressively up the board, and usually if you're doing that with knights, then you might have melee specialists there, so you often might still lose a lot of value by not charging depending on how the board is. At least in theory land though, if you've got big ranged knights that don't mind pushing up the board, then I guess they could be one of the best options to do it though. They still get their firepower and they can do the action and didn't want to charge anyway, and you wouldn't have to give up something like an army just shooting a melee, which is kind of a big deal on an 150 point model or so. In any case, I think it's kind of nice to have that exception for the knight armies. They're often ones that really don't get on too well with their units having to stand around and do nothing outside of allies and things. As mentioned earlier though, it really feels like the biggest impact of this rules change is going to be to OC0 units. These units were generally the ones that were doing loads and loads of actions to get secondary objectives and things, just because OC0 beasts and things often tended to be the very cheapest units that you can field in your army. Things like Tyrannid Rippers or Kroot Hounds, maybe Nurglings or Fenrisian Wolves. Generally you wanted the units to be doing these actions to be the absolute minimal investment that you could possibly make them, as that way you're not really giving up any scary firepower or charging, or having a scary damage dealer sit around and do grunt work rather than get on with attacking the enemy. These guys getting locked out of doing the actions though was something that people have been basically soft protecting for the entirety of 10th edition so far. They did very similar in 9th when small units were often being used to do things like retrieve data missions. They made it so you had to commit something just a little bit more substantial to them. I feel like depending on the army, some of the OC0 units didn't really seem the sort of thing that you'd usually want to trust with any sort of technical work as well, like deploying teleport homers. It Might have varied on the unit and depending on what they were asked to do. Maybe Rippers could reasonably cleanse an objective by devouring everything, but asking Fenrisian Wolves to set up a teleport homer felt kind of curious. In any case, it's certainly very bad news for these units actually being useful in game. It was a little bit weird the way that they were used, but I felt like it was actually kind of fun just to have a limited number of these be a good choice in an army list, some little hangers on to have skirting around the edges of the army, and a bit of incentive to take a few of the little guys. They still would have some value, but it's more just for board control, screening, move blocking, and maybe nuisance charges and things. Most of them tend to be really kind of bad in terms of damage dealing, but some of them are alright in defense, and any unit has a bit of value in taking up its board space. Given that they're doing a points update hand in hand with this, there's at least some chance that they might reduce the points of these little guys a little bit as a result. I think it wouldn't be too unreasonable given that their biggest reason to be taken has just been taken away. Even if they do go down in cost though, I suspect we'll see way less of them as a result, and much more of a pivot towards minimal investment things that have at least one OC. Maybe things like Astra Militarum Tempestus Scions, small units of cultists and things, individual Necron Locust Destroyers perhaps, anything that's got one OC and didn't have zero. The main talking point about this is that Tyranids might feel this as one of the hardest changes. I guess maybe them and any Chaos Army list that was using a lot of Nurglings, which were kind of great for the secondary objective game. Tyranids in particular relied on Biovores farming out Spore Mines to generate a bunch of victory points over the game, just landing minimum OC0 units exactly where they needed them, maybe with the support of a base or two of Rippers if they were feeling generous. I've seen a fair few people lamenting the fact that Tyranids are going to get nerfed by this, though honestly my initial impressions are that it really might not be that bad for Tyranids in the long run. They've been a faction that's been kind of limping into 45% wins and things, and kind of underpowered for the majority of players out there, and Games Workshop not really doing all that much in terms of making their units scary or threatening, due to them being propped up by easily farming victory points and having some battle shock things. I think it's probably not the worst thing for Tyranid builds going forward if you're no longer taking one mandatory Biovore to sit in the corner farming objectives, and actually make some efforts to make Tyranid lists feel a bit more scary again. They certainly don't have too many units that are all that good at taking down things with high toughness and saves. In any case though, let me know what you think of the actions changes down in the comments below. Do you think that this new version is better or worse? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas. I'll certainly be aiming to cover the new mission deck and update in full once we get news of it, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics or check back later if you'd like to see more like this. It's probably going to be a busy weekend over here. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.